Is he going? I don't know. Ask before we start how familiar people are with Machen's work. I mean, put your hand up if you've read anything by him. Oh, okay. But not an expert. Any experts? Good. That's okay, as long as I know, vaguely. Yeah.
Right, welcome everybody, and on behalf of Lucy Parkin, who is currently hosting another event for the Abergavenny Writing Festival, we're so pleased to see you all here in person after having to have the virtual one in 2020, and obviously it's a while since we saw you here before. And I'm personally very delighted to have been asked to introduce Catherine Fisher to talk to you today on Machen's Gwent, which clearly we're all going to learn a lot more about. But I first met Catherine when I went to a residential course in Nettles, which was excellent on young adult writing, and I've never looked back. But anyway, to tell you a little bit more about Catherine, so Catherine is a poet and novelist for children and young people. Her work's been shortlisted for the WBC Tir, the Carnegie and the Costa prizes, and she's won the Welsh Book Council Tin and Noel Prize twice. Her novel Incarceron was a New York Times bestseller, and Catherine is a lifelong fan of Machen's work, and she's a native of Gwent and lives currently in Newport. So please join me in welcoming Catherine.
Thank you very much, everyone. I'm going to start with Machen's own words. This is from his autobiography, Far Off Things. I shall always esteem it the greatest piece of fortune that has fallen to me, that I was born in that noble fallen Caerleon on Usk in the heart of Gwent. My greatest fortune, I mean, from that point of view, which I now more especially have in mind, the career of letters. For the older I grow, the more firmly am I convinced that anything which I may have accomplished in literature is due to the fact that when my eyes were first opened in earliest childhood, they had before them the vision of an enchanted land. As soon as I saw anything, I saw Tumbalum, that mystic tumulus. This guarded the southern limit of the great mountain wall in the west. A little northward was Mynydd Mine, the mountain of the stone. And on fair, clear days, one could see the pointed summit of the Holy Mountain by Abergavenny. It would shine, I remember, a pure blue in the sunshine. It was a mountain peak in a fairy tale. And then, to eastwards, the bedroom window of Llandewi Rectory looked over hill and valley, over high woods, away to the forest of Wetwood, to the church tower above the hill, above Caerleon. Through a cleft, one might now and again see a bright yellow glint of the Severn Sea and the cliffs of Somerset beyond, and hardly a house in sight in all the landscape, look where you would. Machen's Gwent. There it is. It meant everything to him, and he is preeminently, I think, a writer of place or about place, and two places in particular, Gwent and London. Those are his two poles, which sort of reverberate through his work. And it's significant that in his autobiography, and if you want to start reading about him, that's a good place to start, Far Off Things. He talks about his early life, his early childhood. He talks about places more than people. He sort of has loads of description about the place before he even brings in anybody of his family or mentions his family circumstances in any way. Particularly Caerleon, Isbys the dreaming city of Gwent. And below that, below the real landscape, is the sort of layered landscape, the Celtic myths, the Roman history, the medieval stories and events. And for me, I think the landscape for Machen is a sort of palimpsest, it's a sort of manuscript that he reworks over and over again, and he's always trying to come back to whatever it is in that landscape that fascinated him as a child. He's always trying to re-find it, and he uses it over and over again in his stories. And I'm just going to sort of vaguely go through a few of them and just look at the way he uses it and how he uses it. So I came to Machen as a student. I was a teenager. I was at Carnegie and College. It's a very good place to start, really. It was a wet afternoon. I was bored stiff, and I was looking for a book to take home for the weekend. They used to have a really good library there, which I used to haunt. And I came across the Carnegie edition of Machen's books, which is a sort of, uniform edition. And I remember, I don't really remember if I'd heard of him before, but because it was the Carnegie edition, I realised that he was local in some way. And I remember looking at the titles of the books and selecting the one which to me had the most intriguing title, which is The Hill of Dreams. Obviously this is a later version. The Hill of Dreams. Who could resist? I couldn't. Who could resist a book called The Hill of Dreams? I just had to read it. And I took it home and I read it, and I was just blown away, absolutely blown away. I remember reading it late into the night and having weird nightmares and strange dreams, and I felt, intoxicated by it, by the language that he was using, and the fact that he was using real places that I recognised vaguely, and that he was making of them this sort of special, enchanted world, really. So I'm going to give you a little example. The Hill of Dreams was written in 1897, but it wasn't published until about 1907, so it was in his drawer for about 10 years, which is really inspiring for anybody trying to write. I think that your masterpiece can lie in a drawer for 10 years and not be discovered. Oh, there he is. There's the man himself. That's probably his best photograph, I think. So let's prop him up, shall we? So, The Hill of Dreams is a semi-autobiographical novel about a young man who is brought up in Caerleon, has a very lonely childhood, and then spends most of it wandering around the countryside around about there, and begins to experience strange, perhaps opium-induced visions. The bit I'm going to read to you is the bit quite near the beginning of the book, where Lucien, which is the character's name, climbs the hill. And the hill, probably half a real place, half an imagined place. It's a very steep hill. There is a ring of oak trees, and then beyond the oak trees there is what Machen calls a Roman fort. Okay, and in the fort is where Lucien has his strange experience. But I'm going to read this because this shows his engagement with the landscape, his real physical intimacy with the landscape. At first, he stole along by the brook, in the shadow of the alders, where the grass and the flowers of wet meadows grew richly. But as he drew nearer to the fort, and its height now rose sheer above him, he left all shelter and began to mount. There was not a breath of wind. The sunlight shone down on the bare hillside. The loud chirp of the grasshoppers was the only sound. It was a steep ascent, and grew steeper as the valley sank away. He was wet with heat. The sweat streamed off his face, and he could feel it trickling on his body. But above him, the green bastions and the dark ring of oaks promised coolness. He pressed on higher, and at last began to crawl up the vallum on hands and knees, grasping the turf, and here and there the roots that had burst through the red earth. And then he lay panting with deep breaths on the summit. Within the fort it was all dusky and cool and hollow. It was as if one stood at the bottom of a great cup. There were nettles growing thick and rank in the foss, and Lucien, letting his hand touch a leaf by accident, felt the sting burn like fire. Beyond the ditch there was undergrowth, a dense thicket of trees, stunted and old, crooked and withered by the winds into awkward and ugly forms, beech and oak and hazel and ash and yew, twisted and so shortened and deformed that each seemed, like the nettle, of no common kind. He began to fight his way through the ugly growths, stumbling and getting hard knocks from the rebound of twisted boughs. His foot struck once or twice against something harder than wood, and looking down he saw stones, white with the leprosy of age. Sorry, I've skipped a bit there. And further, the roots of stunted trees gripping the foot-high relics of a wall, and a round heap of fallen stones nourished rank, unknown herbs that smelt poisonous. Suddenly, he knew that he was alone, not merely solitary. He had been that often among the woods and deep in the lanes, but now it was a wholly different and very strange sensation. He thought of the valley winding far below him, all its fields, peaceful and still, without track or path. And then he had climbed the abrupt surge of the hill, and behind, as he knew, were many desolate fields, wild as common, untrodden, unvisited. He was utterly alone in the landscape. He still grew hotter as he sat there on the stump, and at last he lay down at full length on the soft grass, and more at his ease felt the waves of heat pass over his body. And then he began to dream. So I think you can see from that how physically he interacts with the landscape. The landscape is almost something that he has to fight his way through, and he really describes in a sort of plotted, matted sort of prose. It's almost poetic in places, isn't it? The sort of struggle up the hill and through the thicket into the open space at the top, the heat, the nettle sting. I believe this experience really happened to him on one hot August day, because he writes about it again in a different story in The Shining Pyramid, where a character, in a much more briefer sequence, has the same experience, even down to the nettle sting on the hand. So I'm sure that this actually happened to Machen, and I'm sure that he fell asleep on top of the hill, and that something happened to him there which he never forgot all his life. In the story, Lucian has some sort of mystical encounter with some sort of spiritual being that inhabits the hill. It's never fully explained, so you read into it what you like, but I'm sure Machen had this experience. So it's intensely real, but it's also a metaphor, right, for the spiritual world. And it's a fearful world, because with Machen, when writing about the countryside, there are two sort of aspects of this: his love for it, his desire for it, and his fear of it. He uses words like awe, he uses words like dread, he uses the words like terror, and ecstasy is another word he uses a lot. So the powers that inhabit the world that is not human, the world out there, he is very conscious of them, and that they are both enchanting and dangerous in some way. And it's these two ideas that make, I think, his fiction so potent when he's writing about the landscape, and when he's putting his stories into this landscape that we know so well. So who was Arthur Machen? Well, he was born Arthur Llewellyn Jones, and he was born in Caerleon in 1863, probably in the house in the High Street that has the plaque claiming to be his birthplace, but possibly not. It's not 100% sure. And he was one of a line of Anglican priests. His grandfather, Daniel Jones, was the vicar of Caerleon for over 27 years and was instrumental in setting up the first legionary museum there. So I think from him he inherited a sense of the deep past of the archaeology which lies underneath the everyday life. His father, John Edward Jones, was also vicar, but not of Caerleon, of two rather more rural parishes, Llanfedd and Llanddewi, which are just outside Caerleon in the Usk Valley. Two very small, poverty-stricken, really, parishes where he's not going to make a great deal of money. His mother was Janet Machen from Greenock in Scotland. I'm not quite sure how they managed to meet, but they did. And the name Machen was added to the family name because of a legacy, I believe. So Arthur became Arthur Machen Jones. His father had the house built at Llandewi Rectory, which is still there, privately owned now. And that's where the family lived. But, as I said, the parishes were very poor. The tithes must have been insignificant. His father spent a lot of money. And basically, his mother was an invalid, chronic invalid, throughout his childhood. He was an only child. So you can see a very sort of isolated existence up there. In the 1880s, there was a financial crash. His father's investments failed, and his father became bankrupt. By this time, Arthur was at school. He was at school in Hereford Cathedral School. And the idea was that he would become an Anglican minister, as his forebears had done. But, of course, the financial crash put an end to that, and he was taken from school because his father could no longer afford the fees, and it became clear that he would not be able to go to university or take orders. And then, in a sense, his future was suddenly gone. The future that presumably he had always considered, an absolute fix had gone. So he came home, he came back to Llandewi Rectory, and he dreamed of becoming a writer. By this time he was really interested in literature. He mooned around the place, he read all the unsuitable books in his father's library. He dreamed, he took long walks, he explored the countryside. And with his father, he went to visit the local houses. His father, obviously being the vicar, was very well in with the local squirearchy and farmers and so on, and had to visit them. And Machen describes in Far Off Things how he went with his father in the pony and trap around the local houses. Lansaw, which is a beautiful house. I'm lucky enough to have been inside. Court Perrott, which is the ancestral home of the Perrott family. Chemist Manor, still there, beautiful house on the side of the road between Monmouth. And above all, Bertholey House, which is a lonely house above the River Usk and below Wetwood, on the slopes, the very steep slopes, looking down over the Usk Valley. So these are places that he knew. He knew the stories, the gossip, the history of the old families that lived there. And also, of course, he knew the churches, the small little ancient churches of the Usk Valley. He often served as altar boy to his father's services. He knew the old monuments that are on the walls, the family histories, the odd, quaint, unexplained things. These got into his mind. And they got into his mind in a big way, really. I'm going to read a little bit from an introduction, a book I did a few years ago called Machen's Gwent. So what sort of countryside is this? Well, I don't need to explain it to you because you live here as I live. It's a hilly landscape characterised by long, deep lanes between high hedges. Small, fast-running streams like the Saw, the Avon Llwyd, the Canthor, all which run down into the Usk, of course. And then there's the Usk itself, meandering, tidal, very far upstream, tidal as far as Newbridge on Usk, I think, so above Caerleon. And a very strange river in many ways, pools, mudbanks, forming a very wide vale. Bordering it are the hills, the Mynydd Mine in the west with Tumbalum, which he always considered a sort of, as he says, the mystic tumulus, crowning the one side of the hill. And then the Skirrid, which you could see from the window of his farmhouse, his rectory, sorry. And then, like a great barrier between the Vale of Usk and the coast is Wetwood. Dark and ominous slopes of Wetwood. Whenever you look at Wetwood, certainly from Newport side, it's always dark. Even when the sun is out, Wetwood is always dark. And you can see it from everywhere. I mean, I live right down by the Transporter Bridge, right down by the bottom end of Newport. You can see it from there. You can see it from everywhere. It's like a sort of, I don't know, sort of thing on the landscape which is always present, like a great shaggy monster thing that's always there. And presumably from Wetwood you can see everywhere as well. And then, as I said, on the slope of Wetwood, below the wood itself, but above the river, is Bertholey House. I don't know if you know that place. It was ruined for many years. The first time I ever went there to find it, it had been burned and it was a ruin, very, very atmospheric and strange place. Now it's been restored and is lived in, but it's still a totemic place for anybody who's interested in Machen's writing. And he describes, in this quote, if I can find it, what it means to him. He says that the house itself is a word in the secret language that he had with himself as a child. And I'm sure you know that for writers, sometimes places do this. You don't know why they're important, but there's something about them that attracts you, that repels you, that interests you, and that inspires your writing. So this is what he wrote in Far Off Things about Bertholli House. He says, "And for some reason, or for no reason, this house, which stood on the boundaries and green walls of my young world, became an object of mysterious attraction to me. It became one of the many symbols of the world of wonder that were offered to me. It became, as it were, a great word in the secret language by which the mysteries were communicated. I thought of it always with something of awe, even of dread. Its appearance was significant of I knew not what." I think it's interesting because even for him, and he's a great writer, his writing breaks down. He can't explain, he can't communicate what actually the house meant to him. And the only way he can communicate it is through fiction, which is what he does. And he uses the house in almost all his books. So, skip through where I am. Now, as I said, he wanted to be a writer. He spent time in London working as a catalogue of occult fiction, which is just like the perfect job for him as a young man, cataloguing a huge library of really strange books and obviously dipping into them and reading them. He was living in a garret in Clarendon Road, living on tea and bread, basically starving in a garret, as you should do. He had no friends, he had no literary connections whatsoever. He was totally unknown in London, but he wanted to be a writer. But he didn't know how to do it, and that's the thing that all writers face when they start out. How do you do it? How do you get your way into fiction? He'd written a book called The Anatomy of Tobacco, hardly the most striking of titles for a young man to write. But he wanted to write fiction. He wanted to write the great romance, but he didn't know how to go about it. And then he received a communication from home that his mother was dying, so he had to come back. And when he came back, his mother did die, and he stayed at Llandewi for a few months, I think over a year, writing this book, which is the Chronicle of Clemendy, which has just been reissued in this handsome edition by the Three Impostors Press of Newport. The Chronicle of Clemendy is a real oddity in Machen's oeuvre, and just an oddity anyway. Basically, he had spent some time translating a book called the Heptameron by Marguerite of Navarre, which is a collection of medieval tales, a bit like Chaucer, a bit like Boccaccio. He was a very good French scholar. And this had got into his head, and he decided that he would start his literary career by writing a pastiche of medieval tales set in Gwent, which, if you think about it, is mad, really, but, he did it. And I think, to be honest, he was in such a bad place. He had no prospects, no money. His mother had just died. That I think this was just a sheer escapism for him. So if you read the Chronicles of Clemendy, it's fun. Dip into it. It's a young man showing off. He digresses all the time. He wallows in language. I mean, he really riots in words. If you're looking for a sort of connected narrative, you're not going to find it. But basically, it's great fun. So it's a series of short stories set in a mock medieval idiom, a bit like sort of William Morris was doing slightly earlier. There are stories set in Abergavenny. The story about how the good folk of Abergavenny paid for a clock to be built on a tower in the town. And on the top of the clock was placed the statue of a knight called Sir Jenkin. and this was solemnly blessed by the prior of the town, and all the good townsfolk of Abergavenny gathered around to watch the service. But during the service, unbeknownst to anybody, a dark character in a dark cloak crept in and made a strange gesture over the statue and disappeared into the crowd. And then after that, when the good folk of Abergavenny were going around their illicit business, like adultery, theft, rustling of cattle, drinking too much, the figure would come down off the clock and stop them, basically, would attack them with its sword. So after a while they got fed up of this, and the statue was taken into the high street and burned ceremoniously, and then after that the good folk of Abergavenny could go around doing their crimes without anybody knowing. That's a flavour of the sort of story we've got here. There are stories about people digging up treasure in St. Julian's Wood. There's a story about a knight who finds a door in a tree near us and goes into it and finds a sort of strange underground world. There are stories of priors, drunken monks. There's plenty of drunken monks. There's a giant sausage. There are all sorts of things going on in this book. It's great fun if you're not looking for anything too serious, and if you can put up with this sort of mock medieval idiom, if you can stay with that. Great fun. Nothing like anything else he ever wrote, really. Never published, of course. Couldn't have been published. He couldn't find a publisher for it. Not until much, much, much later. But it's interesting that he chose Gwent to write about. He didn't set this in some abstruse, French landscape. Or he chose Abergavenny, and he chose Usk, and he chose Caerleon, places he knew. Although he slightly changes the names to Abergavenny and things like that. So that's the Chronicle of Clemendy. I need to keep an eye on the time. Yes, okay. And how did he use Gwent in his later books? Well, it haunted his writings. He decided that he had to write something that would sell. Back in London, we're in the naughty 90s, the yellow 90s, Oscar Wilde, Aubrey Beardsley, opium, absinthe, everything going on, Stevenson, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, H.G. Wells' early novels, Arthur Conan Doyle. So the decadent is in. Machen decides that he will write a potboiler, so he creates the great god Pan. It's a cracking read. If you want to start with Machen fiction, start with this. It's, where does it start? It starts at Bertholli House, where two scientists, there's always a mad scientist, Dr. Raymond and his associate, Mr. Clark, are discussing the experiment that they will carry out on a young, innocent girl from a nearby village called Mary, and they are planning to operate on her brain so that the veil will be lifted before her eyes and she will be able to see the god Pan in the idiom of the day. She will be able to see the unseen world. And they carry out this experiment. The description at the beginning of the book of the house, you could go there now and read it, and it is perfect. The hanging forest of Wetwood, the mystic S's of the river, the bridge, which is New Bridge, and the terrace, it's all still there. And of course it all goes horribly wrong. She dies insane. Her daughter, Helen Vaughan, who is the daughter of herself and, it is implied, some Pan-like creature, returns to London and begins to haunt London and cause mayhem among the upper-class young men of the capital. So it's a mixture. It's very Stevenson-esque. It's very. He was very influenced by Robert Louis Stevenson's books like The Dynamiter, The New Arabian Nights, The Suicide Club, and Jekyll and Hyde in particular. It was a massive success. I mean, it blew Machen onto the stage. Suddenly, he was somebody. He was dining with Oscar Wilde. He was, and Wilde actually congratulated him on the success of the great god Pan. So suddenly, he was well known among the cognoscenti, if you like. After that, he wrote The Three Impostors, which I don't have a copy of, but again, a similar idea, a nest of stories. It's interesting because it's an early example of the unreliable narrator. So basically the story, a man is walking through London late at night and he's accosted, he sees a young man in spectacles burst out of a street, run in front of him into another street, and he drops a coin, which the passerby then picks up, and then he sees three characters chasing this guy, and he's got the denarius. And you learn that the man is he has betrayed a secret society and they are after him to kill him, essentially, or to submit him to some horrific rites. And the three impostors each tell a tale, so they each tell a separate story within the book to a gullible listener trying to find out more about the young man in spectacles. Sounds convoluted. The three tales are actually quite separate and are often anthologized separately. But one of them, the novel of the Black Seal, again takes place in Gwent, where the woman who tells the story, Miss Lally, she tells it on a bench in Leicester Square to the man sitting next to her. She tells the story of how she becomes a governess and is taken to a mysterious house in the far west, which is here, of course, to become a governess to Professor Gregg and his three children, and how Professor Gregg is fascinated by the Black Seal, which has strange cuneiform letters on it, and how he has a theory that living in the hills of this strange country are troglodytic, fairy-type creatures that still exist after many, many centuries. You know, they're almost prehistoric, but still exist secretly in the landscape. And basically, Professor Gregg goes out one dark, lonely night to the Grey Hills, which is, of course, Grey Hill, above Wetwood, where there is a stone circle where you don't go at night, basically. And he goes out there and is never seen again, and he is taken by the creatures that live there. It's a great story, but very much set at Batholi House. So Machen was using these landscapes. He was using London, but he was also using, as an opposite to London, as a sort of comparison to London is the sort of civilized, urban, strange, and Gothic, and Gwent is the prehistoric, dark, you know, sort of the roots of where everything comes from. He uses it in a story called A Fragment of Life, which is a really interesting story, actually, about a suburban couple who live in London and they're very unsatisfied with their lives. They have basic, you know, the guy is a commuter, the woman is a housewife, although this is obviously set in Edwardian times. But they have no depth to their lives, and gradually they become to be obsessed with the idea of moving out of London and trying to find somewhere else that has more potency in the landscape. Again, they end up in Gwent. And then we come to the white people, which is actually in this collection, as well as many others. It's interesting that Machen, after being out of print for so many years, is now so obtainable in these classic editions. He's in the Oxford, he's also in the Penguin. He's really coming back into fashion in many ways. The White People has been called one of the greatest occult stories ever written, and I think it is. It is a very strange story. Has anybody ever read it? Has come across it? Okay, it's a novella, it's quite short. Two men, they're always usual, two scientists. This is the cover story. They find a diary, the Green Book, which is written by a young girl. And Machen writes it in an unparagraphed, unpunctuated outburst. All right, so it's just and. But it is actually well written, it's not annoying. But it's in her voice, it's in the voice of a young girl. And she is not ever specified where she's living, but we know where she's living here. And she is living the sort of life Machen lived as a teenager, so she's very much involved in the landscape. Her parents are not really featured in the story. She's looked after by a nurse, an old nurse, who fills her head with old folk tales and weird, odd tales about the landscape, about people who disappear, about strange rites going on stones at Halloween and so on. And the girl herself begins to involve herself in the landscape. She goes out, she crawls into the wood, she meets people, she learns words out of languages, and all the time she is telling you this story as a child would tell it. And you, the reader, have to interpret what is going on here. And it is very, very sinister. You begin to understand that the child is being corrupted in some way, is learning things that she shouldn't learn, that is becoming enmeshed in some sort of horrible, rites, and meeting sort of elemental creatures that she shouldn't be. and she's gradually becoming old, in a sense, before your eyes. And you really want to sort of try and stop this, but you can't because obviously you're not there. And then the story breaks off quite dramatically, and the two men discuss it, and they discuss the nature of evil and what evil is and what happened to the girl, after the story was over. It's a tour de force, really. I mean, if you haven't read it, I really would recommend it. It's very hard to describe the nature of the atmosphere that it gives you, but you will not sleep at night after reading it. It is really creepy, and it has this sort of fear, this element of fear and dread that he is really good at evoking. It's been hugely influential in sorts of horror, weird fiction, writing and films. I mean, people like Del Toro, Pan's Labyrinth, for instance, these sort of people always reference the white people as one of their sources. And it's just a masterpiece, I think, of like slowly accumulating dread, and you're not really sure what it is you fear, but you fear it. So I'll just wind up in case we have any questions, I think. So he never really left Gwent. He did leave Gwent. He moved to London, obviously. He became... he made some money from his writing, but not really enough to live on. He had a small legacy. When that ran out, he married twice, I should say. His first wife died quite young. And then he went into... After his first wife died, he had a period of when he was really interested in the occult. He joined the Order of the Golden Dawn with Yeats and Waite and other people. But that didn't really satisfy him. I think he always felt there was something of the charlatan about it. He wasn't really into seances or spiritualism, the sort of current things at the time. He was always looking for something else. He had a strange period where he became an actor, which I always find really fascinating, that any writer who is not really a performer could go out there and become an actor. He became a Shakespearean actor and toured around doing Shakespeare. And then after that he became a journalist and was a journalist for many years on London papers, the Evening Standard in particular. He hated it. He absolutely hated it. It was hack work, but he had to do it to make money and to live. And it was as a journalist that he entered his second phase of fame. The first phase being the Great God Pan, which of course ended as soon as the Oscar Wilde trial happened, and suddenly the Decadent was way out of fashion and Machen fell out of fashion. His second phase of fame was the famous Angels of Mons episode, which you may have heard of, where he wrote during the First World War, 1914, on St. Michael's Day, 29th of September. He published in the Evening Standard a short story called The Bowmen, which is written in a journalistic sort of way, as if it really happened, but it's actually fiction, where he writes that during the retreat from Mons, certain British soldiers saw an apparition in the sky of bowmen, the bowmen of Agincourt, who were covering the retreat, as it were, of the British troops from Mons. Now this is fiction. Machen always swore that it was fiction, and then he made it up. But somehow it obviously tapped into the zeitgeist of the time. And it was written in a way that, in a very reportage way, as if he had taken statements from these people. And so yeah, people started to believe it, and basically it became, he had to keep writing to people and refuting it, saying, no, this was actually fiction, but it became a myth, and still is believed in by many people, and there have been many books about it, and it's become this myth of the Angels of Mons. Machen always claimed it started with him. I don't know. Maybe he got it from somewhere else. Writers pick things up sometimes out of the atmosphere. But yeah, that made him famous again. But he lived in Newport, in London, all his life. He did come back. He had no family here. He had nowhere to live here. But he did visit. There was an occasion when a great dinner was held in his honour in the King's Arms, I think it was. King's Arms? Queen's.
Westgate.
In,
Westgate.
Sorry?
Westgate.
The Westgate, sorry. The Westgate. In Newport. And if you go into Newport Library, where there is a great collection of Machen material, which you can consult, the menu is there, and signed by all those who were there, including W.H. Davis was there, wasn't he? Yeah, and several other writers. And a collection was taken up, a subscription for Machen from sort of various famous writers around the place, and presented to him because, you know, by this time he was on his uppers, pretty much. He was on his uppers most of his life, let's be honest. So yeah, that happened. So he was recognised in this part of the world as being a Welsh writer, and even though his relationship with Wales was ambivalent in some ways, he often referred to Gwent as the West, or sometimes the West of England, which is like, what? But now, but later in his life, he started to refer to it more as Wales and became more of conscious of himself as a Welsh writer. And if you listen to his voice, because there is a recording of him, which you can listen to on Facebook, not Facebook, YouTube, a BBC recording right at the end of his life. If you listen to that, he is very Welsh. His voice, his accent is completely, local still. Whether he's putting it on a bit, I don't know. But yeah, he never left in many ways. And his final piece of published writing is an introduction to Fred Hando's book. Fred Hando is a local historian from Newport who wrote a series of books about Gwent, which I'm sure you've come across. He wrote one called The Pleasant Land of Gwent. And he asked Machen, as a very elderly man, to do the intro. And Machen did it, he wrote it. And in it he says, you know, Mr. Hando has written about Gwent as it is. I wrote about Gwent as I wished it was, or as I saw it. He writes the facts, I write the imaginary. And he reminisces again in that introduction, in a very sort of nostalgic way, really, about the things that he had seen and the things that he had imagined of them. And he ends by saying, you know, and how he remembers the great wind on the mountain above Pontypool, whispering in his ears the words forever and ever, amen. As if, you know, the whole thing is still, for him, a mystical landscape as well as a real place. So essentially, that's how he used Gwent, and how Gwent used him in many ways in his work. So if anyone has any observations or questions, now is the time.
Yeah, I was going to say we've got a few minutes now, if you'd like to, a few questions.
That was really interesting. I learned a lot.
Thank you.
Is your book on Machen's Gwent, is that available?
Unfortunately not. It was a limited edition by the Three Impostors. There were only 200 copies printed,
Okay.
and there are none left. Is that right?
I think there are a few over in the museum.
In the museum, right.
Okay.
So there are a few in the museum,
Okay.
but they are running out
It's about 4.
shortly.
Okay. I better get
We
it.
have to run.
You hinted at opium being a factor. Is it, you elaborate on that?
Well, as I said, you know, the yellow 90s, everyone was at it, weren't they? If it wasn't opium, it was absinthe. But I'm sure Machen tasted opium. I'm sure he experimented with it. In The Hill of Dreams, which I didn't mention, there is a chapter, chapter 2, I think, The Garden of Avalonius, where the character Lucian goes into the Roman amphitheatre in Caerleon, and it's obviously in a highly opium state, influenced state, and he dreams of Caerleon as it was, or maybe as it never was, in Roman times. So the whole chapter is an opium-influenced dream of Roman Caerleon. It's fascinating to read.
And the very last chapter as well, where he's at his desk,
Yes.
which is the most extraordinary.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? Because at the end he dies in London alone, Lucian. Again, as you say, in fact, the whole of the end of the book,
It just goes round and round, and it's incredible.
you don't know what's real and what's not. He is so stoned, should we say, through most of the end of the book, that what he sees in London and how he lives is you just don't know what's real and what's not. And he dies tragically, slumped over his desk, as it were, with his manuscript, his great book that he's put all his heart and soul into there, and it's illegible. It cannot be read, and the landlady who comes up and sees it throws it away because it cannot be read. It's a terrible tragedy. But it's just an amazing book. I'm sure Machen did experiment with opium, clearly.
The Tholey House, is it just there's the wheat sheaf at Llanhenol, and then you can make your way down toward the river. And there's a big house with
That-
white columns.
No, that's Glen Usk.
Ah,
No, Betholi is further up the valley,
right.
and is literally, it's hard to get, there's just one little road, which,
Road.
you know the main road towards, between Monmouth and Newport,
Yeah.
I forget what it's called, but the big dual carriageway, there's a sort of lane which goes under that,
Right.
and then goes up toward, and it just goes to Betholi House, there's nothing else there. You can walk through Wetwood down to it, and there's a footpath near it, and you can see it quite clearly. But no, that's Glen Usk you're thinking of.
Sorry, how do you spell that?
Bertholly. I think it's from the Welsh for orchards, probably. It's an interesting place. As I say, it's privately owned at the moment, so you can't actually...
Do you think that, you know, the sort of fascination in things like, as you said, the novel of the Black Seal, about a sort of deep history, sort of almost like children of Cain, sort of fairy type people. Do you think that sort of ties in with that interest of people like Ella and Mary Leather at the same time, who were sort of gathering, sort of, because that must have been about the same sort of time, must have been around about the...
I think there was a theory at the time, wasn't there, that this idea that was current at the time of these sort of, you know, small cave-like people who sort of were leftovers from some prehistoric, you know, there was a sort of idea of it around, and I think he taps into that and uses that because it suits his way of writing about the landscape. He wants to sort of embody the sort of fear that he feels of the landscape and the dread, and those creatures do that for him. And there's also, I mean, I was reading the other day an article which suggested that, you know, Darwin's writings at the time, that the whole idea of evolution and the deep past scared the hell out of the Victorians, you know. I mean, the idea that the Bible, you know, 4,000 years ago the world was created in 7 days, that all went out of the window, and they had to deal with that, they had to take that on board. So this idea of the deep geological past became a fear, which was somehow comes out in these sort of stories. It's
And
somehow
you see that in the sort of death of Helen Vaughan, don't you? She sort of degenerates back to
well,
slime.
yeah, that's the other thing. Degeneration is another sort of trope that comes through. The idea of the human body dissolving into its constituents, dissolving away, and not just dissolving, but regressing back to a sort of medieval, no, not medieval, much before that, you know, sort of primeval, that's the word I'm looking for. A primeval slime actually falling apart in many ways comes out. And yeah, that's what happens to Helen Vaughan at the end of The Hill of Dreams. Horribly. Lovely, horribly. He's very good at horror. He's really good. He will really make you shiver. Yeah, sorry.
I've got a favourite deep lane running down to Lamfrecffer,
Yeah,
which I've written about.
it's probably the one, is it?
Have you got a favourite location
I
that you
think-
point us to?
Yeah, there is a lane, isn't there, at the back of Llandewi Rectory, which sort of goes into, nowhere really, but I think that's the lane that he writes about in the beginning of The Hill of Dreams, where he walks down the old deep lane. But it's very difficult to pinpoint, because as most writers do, they take liberties with places and they move them around and things. So I think that, you know, The Hill of Dreams itself is very difficult to say exactly which hill or where, or whether he's used elements of different places and put them together. So I have various places that I mean, Grey Hill for me is a place which is very Machen-esque, especially at night, when the nightjars would start churring up there. And I once stayed up there on a Halloween evening, and it got dark, and I shouldn't have stayed there that long, because then you have to come down through the forest after dark, and you don't want to do that.
I was once went with a group of naturalists who went and listened to the nightjars,
Yeah.
and there were also glowworms around.
Yeah,
It was
it's a spooky
very
one.
atmospheric.
And the sound of the nightjars is very...
Another question.
Did you have any contact with scientists? You see, yes, scientists as his characters. And Alfred Russel Wallace, did you have any contact with him?
He loathed science. He was, as I say, he was from a long line of priests. And I don't mean that that's necessarily but he hated science, he hated progress. He felt that it was destroying the past in many ways and destroying sort of traditional views of things. He was quite Tory in his politics. But no, he didn't like science, and he saw it as a threat, as indeed Many people did, and you know that's why the mad scientist idea in the Great
One
God Pan.
has got into spiritualism as well. So
Yeah, yeah.
from
But
the
it's
same area.
the same idea as, for instance, in the Island of Dr. Moreau by Wells. The idea that, you know, the scientist is going too far, is taking things too far, is conducting experiments that should not be conducted, that are going into a sort of mystical realm where they should not trespass, comes through very clearly, I think, in Machen. He didn't like science at all. He accepted it, but he didn't really like it.
Another question?
Yeah, Machen's journalism and non-fiction is routinely described as hack work, but it included coverage of the Sydney Street siege for the Evening News and some remarkable essays.
Yeah.
How do you rate it?
I think he was good. Yeah, I mean, he became more, I suppose, what we would call a feature writer, didn't he? He wasn't just a reporter. And certainly, yeah, if you read his stuff, he does have. There is a sense that he's doing it for the money, but he does have he always has a good style. He's always eminently readable. And yeah, so I think some of his literary work does carry over into the journalism. And obviously there are collections of it now that you can read and you think, yeah, that is really, really well written. So I think he became a sort of well-known feature writer, and he did cover, you know, plenty of interesting events.
I think I read somewhere that he was one of the first reviewers of James Joyce's Dubliners, and loads of people had turned it down, and he had said, no, this is actually really good.
Yeah, I can see that. I don't know if, I didn't know that, but I could see that.
I can't remember where I read it now.
Yeah.
But I read it somewhere.
He did review lots of, you know, later writers, obviously, and he was always very generous with his praise, and he could always, you know, he sort of really looked for the new in literature. He wasn't conservative in that respect. He was always looking for people who experimented. So I can see that he would be interested in Joyce.
Did I see that on the website advertising this, it said that there's an exhibition?
Yeah, I just coming
but
to
it's
that.
not on the Abergavenny Museum website. It says there are no temporary exhibitions on there. So
Right,
I was a
can I-
bit confused.
Yes. Can I just say we were going to allow Anne Rainsbury, who's here from the library, to talk about, from the museum,
Yeah,
to
would
talk
you-
about that in there.
Would you
Government.
tell them
Do you
about
wanna do that now?
Yeah.
I stress I'm not responsible for the website. Yes, I mean it's interesting because the exhibition at the museum is, if you like, the artistic vision of those words. So it's very much the illustrations that have been generated for the Three Impostors reprints of Machen's work and other artwork that's been inspired by Machen. So it's another dimension, if you like, of how then that his visions have become artistic visions. But you will also find their books and writings and wonderful things that belong to him, his scrapbook, and you mentioned about the dinner and the raising of money for him in
So there are items from
later
that there as
on.
well.
So there are the subscriptions to that, the letters to people, who were the supporters were, the dinner, and that kind of thing. So there are snippets about his life, and there are the other books, the original books with
Yeah.
the Beardsley covers. It was Audrey Beardsley. It was the illustration. I got really excited about that, but then a bit slightly disappointed that it was just a cover and the inside
Yeah, it's just the cover, isn't it?
title
Yeah.
page rather
The
than
keynote
they were-
series.
The
Yeah.
keynote series was not an illustrated book. So really, the illustrations that the Three Impostors Press
Yeah, I mean the
are
woodcuts
doing
from this
are
book.
phenomenal, I think.
These are there, are they?
Yes,
Yeah.
this is the Chronicle.
So these are great because they
Clemendy.
really illustrate the sort of bawdy, merry, jolly, weird, strange nature of the stories. So these are there, and also I believe his punch bowl is there. Is it? Is that
the
there?
tobacco
The
bowl.
tobacco bowl.
Yes,
That's it, where he
the
mixed his tobacco.
bowl, right from the
Amazing.
yes.
So yeah, I mean the idea was that after this talk, those who wished to would go across. I mean we're going across to have a look at it and see the exhibition that's
So
on.
it's open until December and 11 till 4 every day, except Wednesdays. Please come, please tell your friends.
And there are 4 copies of this there. So
And there are copies
And there are
of
copies
many
of-
of the
yeah.
Three Impostors
yeah.
prints and other stories inspired by Machen.
Okay.
Are there any other final questions?
Yeah.
Time for one more.
Thank you very much. This is the first time I've come across Machen. I
Oh,
signed
really?
up because your books are on my daughter's
Oh,
bookshelf.
right, okay.
And I was intrigued by the name Machen. I'm coming at this from a Welsh language perspective. Was there any influence on him by the Welsh language? Obviously he has a very Welsh name, Arthur Llewellyn Jones, and Machen is potentially from the place in Caerphilly.
It has nothing to do with the
No?
place, no. It was his mother's Scottish name.
Right.
So it was from Scottish heritage. And they had to, they incorporated it into their own name because of a legacy, and that was part of it.
Okay, so that's
So it's got nothing to do with Machen near Caerphilly. He didn't speak Welsh. He knew words of Welsh.
because the area would still have been Welsh.
There would have been
speaking
some
when
still
he was
Welsh
young.
speaking, yeah. But I don't think Machen had much Welsh, to be honest with you.
Okay.
But he certainly used words of it, phrases, with varying degrees of accuracy, I think, in some of his stories. But, you know, his Welshness was not of the language, but it was of the place, I think.
Okay. Thank you.
So can I just ask, were some of his books published after his death, or
Oh.
all this?
Yes, I mean, he's being reprinted all the time. He was, during his, at the end of his life, toward the end of his life, America sort of cottoned onto him, and scholars began reading his stuff, and suddenly there was a huge renaissance of Machen studies, and his books began to be republished. I was thrilled a few years ago because the Library of Wales published The Hill of Dreams as one of their classic series, and they asked me to write the introduction to this. And I was like, this is so surreal, you know. I was a kid in Killeen Library finding this in the obscure shelf and getting blown away. And now I'm writing the introduction to it. It was really, really strange. But yeah, I mean, as I said, with the... so he's now a classic writer, you know, and he would have laughed, I think. He would have been really tickled to think that he was in Oxford Classics with what he considered a potboiler, like, you know, The Great God Pound, which was written to make some money. It's also in the Oxford books and the Penguin books, and there are loads of reprints. Tartarus books, I don't know if you know Tartarus, they do reprints of his, and of course the Three Impostors have reproduced the 3 volumes of the autobiography, The Great God Pan and the Three Impostors, and now Clemendy. So yeah, really beautiful editions too, really collectible.
What's your favourite? Do you have a favourite?
The White People, because I just marvel at the power of it. That's my favourite, yeah.
Did you have any contact, I'm not even sure, anywhere with people like Ulton and Blackwood and Robert Aikman?
Not Aikman, Aikman was later.
Okay.
But Blackwood, I think they probably overlapped in time, but I'm not sure if they ever met or if he knew of his work.
It's kind of, we talk about string, writers of the string, don't they, as much as
Yeah.
horror as such.
I'm sure Blackwood and people like him, Ambrose Bierce, people like that, would have, you know, read Machen. And obviously people like Lovecraft, H.P. Lovecraft, always cites Machen as one of his chief, you know, inspirations. So he is hugely influential in the genre and becoming more known also as a Welsh writer now, I think.
Right, at that point I have to stop the question. So thank you very much all for coming, and can you join me in thanking Catherine? And just 2 notes. One, obviously, we've got the opportunity to go over to the museum if you'd like to look at the exhibition. And we've got a few evaluation forms, so if anybody would be willing, probably going to do it, we'll hand them out. But thank you very much, and thank you, Anne, for joining us.
I forgot to say, oh sorry, I forgot to say I've got a few of my own books, just in case anybody is interested, and there are also a few on the bookshelf over there.
Yeah, we've got more films.
Yeah, I just bought a few of these as well. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.